The question, who gets to be Indian, makes people really uncomfortable because it forces us to confront the relationship between self identification on the one hand and authority on the other. This is a question about power, not purity. And I want to acknowledge right off the bat it's a very emotional conversation. It brings up a lot of feelings in people. And I think at the foundation of that are about accusations of gatekeeping, and I hear this a lot. I've noticed that it's mostly from people who have unsubstantiated claims to indigeneity or insecurities about their nativeness, whether they have it or not. And these are the people that will often resort to this argument, but not always. Underneath that is anger, but the thing about anger that I've noticed also is that it's often a cover emotion, and underneath that is fear. And here I mean fear of exclusion. Again, from especially from people who are insecure about their own nativeness, or maybe they don't have, documentation of their nativeness, and there's this fear that they'll be rejected and as native, and that they'll be called a pretendian or a wannabe. It's fears of not being accepted as Native American. But this discomfort, it tells us something really important, and it tells us that it's something that we need to talk about. Why might people avoid asking the question? And here I think about some of the frameworks that we think within in terms of our American citizenship, or even Canadian to some extent as well. And I'm thinking here about multiculturalism. And that's just a fancy academic term that's more commonly known as the melting pot theory. We often hear that the US is a big multicultural melting pot. In popular culture, there's this belief that identity is personal. And because it's personal, it's not subject to the scrutiny of others. And what follows from that is that when identity is personal, it's a possession, it's something that you own. And because it's something that you own, it's yours, nobody has the right to question it. I also think about anti racism discourse. Um, Statements like, questioning identity is harmful, or claims of lateral violence when people with unsubstantiated claims to indigeneity are called out as pretendians. For example, we really saw this when Sasheen Littlefeather and Buffy St. Marie were exposed as pretendians. And I think it's because we really don't like to have our heroes be taken down, even when they can't prove who they are. And then trauma narratives are, a part of this too. Some people seem to think that we shouldn't be asking this question when so many people have been displaced through histories of assimilation, adoption, and other kinds of federal abuses. There's this desire not to re traumatize, and rightly so, not to perpetuate harm. But the question exists whether we like it or not. And here I want to kind of pivot from the feelingness of it to the structural aspect of it. So, feelings to structure, that is that nativeness is not based on how we feel about it, but it's based on tangible things like things rooted in social structures and material realities. So there's some key points here. And it starts with the fact that tribes are political entities, not cultural clubs. Tribes as nations have political relationships to the US state, and the Canadian state as well, although there are some, for various reasons, who have been excluded. But these are not to be confused with groups who have no substantiated historical existence, and or people who lack documented ancestry. Resources are at stake. Citizenship in a federally recognized tribe means having access to a variety of material goods, which I'll say more about in a minute. But here's the key point. The state already asks the question, who gets to be Indian? U.S. colonization forcibly subjugated tribal nations to into this relationship of domination unconsentingly, and impose these ideas about blood quantum and enrollment when it created, what we know of as the modern Indian tribe today under the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. But we have to keep in mind that blood quantum artificially racializes Native people. It's not a concept that Native people had in their cultures, and that's something that I'll be talking about a lot in these videos. But avoiding the question doesn't make power disappear. So, whether we like it or not, we can't avoid the fact that tribes are governmental entities with these political relationships to the state. And this is what our ancestors fought for when they entered into treaties with the US and Canada in the interest of guaranteeing rights to their lands and resources for generations to come. They were forced into those agreements. But without federally recognized tribes and legally defined Indians, there are simply no tribal people that the state is legally obligated to respect. This means that at its core, Native Americanness is definable as a political reality, not as a personal possession, as in something that's my identity, something that I own. That's not to say that one cannot be legitimately Native American if they are not formally affiliated with a federally recognized tribe, because there are countless ways that can happen, but that's a separate conversation. Also, should acknowledge that federal and state recognition pathways are controversial, and it raises questions such as, is the federal acknowledgement process colonial gatekeeping, or is it a framework for accountability? And what about congressional and state recognition? Do they sidestep rigorous processes for proving ancestry and historical political existence? Because there's a lot of evidence that's the case. And we'll often hear people downplay federal recognition even while they're striving to achieve it. So those questions need to be asked. And there are other considerations too. Coming back to this topic of resources, where claims to indigeneity are often driven merely by this desire to access resources, things like scholarships and healthcare and government loans and contracts and many other things. Increased visibility of Native issues, which are associated with cultural clout, can also lead to access to resources. And here I'm referring to things like the land back movement, to entertainment, to academia and government and publishing, even things like Native-led conservation and climate change policy debates. All of these and more involve access to resources in things like government granting programs and philanthropy granting programs. And there's another thing that we need to bring up too, and that claims to indigeneity are not always about access to resources, but access to other non-tangible things that I think of in terms of psychological benefits. And what I mean is the ability to disassociate from colonialism. So even when it's about not seeking resources, there's this need to distance oneself from America's history of violence toward Native people. And we'll hear this in things when people say things like, well, it wasn't my family that did these horrible things. We're victims here too. We're not part of the problem. And then another thing to keep in mind too is DNA tests and ancestry databases. And they often dangle the hope of finding Native ancestry to reinforce unsubstantiated family narratives about Indian ancestry, despite not having a connection to a tribe or a lived experience as Native. So we're in a moment where identity feels both more open and more contested. This question is not about racial purity. Although blood quantum does invoke questions about racial purity, and it's one of the reasons we need to talk about it. It's also not about personal belonging or feelings. And here I mean talking about narratives like being Indian is about what's in your heart, or I don't need a piece of paper to prove I'm Indian, and these kinds of statements that I've heard a lot in my life. It's also not about denying history or trauma, and it's not about deciding who is authentically native in a cultural sense. What the question really is about collective political authority. It's about responsibility to community and not just to self. So that means that it's about accountability versus inclusion. And it's about survival under settler colonialism. The question isn't about who gets in, it's about why, how, and who gets to decide. So that's, hopefully sets the tone for what this channel is about. This is about an acknowledgement that the discomfort's not going to disappear if we don't talk about it. This is an invitation to think through these very difficult thoughts and ideas, not necessarily to agree. And this is what future videos on this channel will explore. So these are questions that I explore in much more depth in my book, Who Gets to Be Indian, Ethnic Fraud, Disenrollment, and Other Difficult Conversations About Native American Identity. So if you're willing to stay with the discomfort, you're in the right place. Please check back for future videos and remember to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the future. Thanks for listening.